This is very formal today because we have the honor of being on the Washington Note. And also, well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for doing this. Michael's writings on this very issue, I think, are that's what kind of got New America on my radar screen back when I was in journalism, and it was Michael's writings on the subject are what got me thinking that this was a pretty interesting place, New America specifically, but also that there was quite a lot of interesting work that was vibrant and intellectually hip, if we can say that occurred at think tanks. So I figured if I played my cards right, and if the newspaper will continue to implode, maybe I could end up at a place like this too. So it's a great pleasure to be hosting this lunch. Also, many of you will have seen that we have a new arrangement with the New York Times, where they write, a 2,000-word essay or so to frame each fellow's lunch from going forward. So thank you, Michael, for pulling strings there with the book review. Also, just a quick heads up, Megan McArdle is doing the next fellow's lunch on May 5th. Her subject is why we celebrate Cinco de Mayo. And then Barry Lynn is doing the June lunch on why we need more mergers and concentration of industry. That's all the material I've got. So, Michael, the floor is yours. Whatever happened to the Radical Center?
Well, thank you, Andres. Several months ago, Andres asked me to give a talk on the Radical Center, a book I co-authored with Ted Halstead, former president of New America, published in fall of 2001. Looking back at it, from my own personal perspective, I can't speak for Ted's view. From the perspective of nearly a decade later, much to the surprise of all of us, last night Sam Tannenhouse, the editor of the New York Book Review, without telling us in advance, published a long essay, as Andres mentioned, about the Radical Center, focused on the book, but also looking at the history of the concept and of the phrase, which was first used by a political scientist named Donald Warren in a book about alienated voters in the 1970s. So I recommend there are copies here, and those of you watching online can go to the New York Times Book Review. The essay will be published on Sunday as a back page essay, and you can see it. It's already up online at the New York Times Book Review site. So the title I've chosen is The Radical Center, a Decade Later, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, from the Clint Eastwood movie. I need to explain the circumstances in which it originated, which are both political and institutional. The New America Foundation was first founded by four individuals: Walter Mead, Cheryl Schwinninger, Ted Halstead, and myself. We came together in 1997 and 1998. And the initial working title was the Vision Trust, and the purpose was to provide fellowships for definitely progressive journalists and scholars. The initial money came from the Arca Foundation and from Norman Lear. Partly as a result of my joining this group, I persuaded my colleagues that Washington actually needed a think tank rather than simply a Shorenstein Center for Journalism, which already existed at Harvard. And it needed a think tank that would represent viewpoints that were excluded from the U.S. establishment in the 1990s. At that point, and again, you have to go back to really the mid-1990s is the context of this. Essentially, New Deal liberalism had collapsed. The left, such as it was consumed with issues of identity politics, race and gender. And all of us were fairly liberal on social issues, but we were interested in political economy. And at that point in the mid and late 90s, liberals were mostly focused either on defending New Deal social programs like Social Security and Medicare, which needed to be defended, but that was a purely backward-looking thing, or in some cases the particular privileges of particular labor unions. So we had this strange political system in which you had a dominant economic conservatism shared both by conservative Republicans, but also by neoliberal Democrats, like the Clinton administration. And on the left, you had largely social issues and environmentalism, and very little political economy. So as Ted and I wrote in the Radical Center, our purpose, first in founding New America, and then in writing the book, was not, it's beyond left and right, but that was the social left. It wasn't the economic left. We made it clear from the beginning that our purpose was to oppose libertarianism and economic conservatism, not on all fronts, but as a philosophy, and that we were reinventing the New Deal and the Great Society of Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson for the 20th century. So the idea was not that, this was not the libertarian critique of the New Deal, that it was all a mistake and we should go back to Calvin Coolidge. But it was rather that Roosevelt and Johnson did exactly the right things by and large in their eras. But because of changes, largely technological and economic changes, we need to come up with something different. And so we changed the name from the Vision Trust to the New America Foundation. It's named after my book, The Next American Nation, which I published in 1995. Ted and I were discussing various names, so he wanted to call it the Next America Foundation after the book. And so I said, well, everyone always misremembers the name. They always say the New American Nation. They never say the Next American Nation. They say, I read your book, The New American Nation. So I said, if you call it the Next America Foundation, they'll call it the New America Foundation. So we might as well, go with it. And so the foundation started. It was sort of a small group at first. Ted was the one who came up with the idea of having kind of a manifesto or a kind of visionary statement. And so we began writing the Radical Center, which at that point had the very lame title of the Smart Society. The Radical Center came later. And by that time, we had brought on some people who are still with us, Michael Calabrese and Phil Longman, Maya McGinnis, Ray Bashara. They all helped us with various aspects of our thinking about the book, although at the end of the day it represented our considered judgments at the time, and so they can claim credit for anything they agree with and disclaim credit for anything they disagree with. So that was the origin of this policy manifesto. It was published more or less on, it was originally supposed to be published more or less on 9/11/2001. And so because of the terrorist attacks, we pushed it back to November, and we got a fair amount of attention, notwithstanding the fact that the subject of the national conversation had changed, at least temporarily. So the phrase, the Radical Center, brief quiz. This is a neo-Maoist commune in Berkeley, a new public philosophy, a voting bloc, or both B and C. The correct answer is both B and C. And this was a source of some tension then, and I think in retrospect as well, because our main purpose, as I say, was coming up with a 21st century version of the New Deal, Great Society liberalism, something which, if there had been a functioning economic left in the 90s, would have been unnecessary center left. But we were sort of filling the void. To the extent that we were beyond left, it was simply because we were rejecting a lot of the extreme multiculturalism, open borders, immigration policy, things like that, which I won't spend a whole lot of time on because it's pretty much died out in the last decade. If just from Barack Obama's policies and rhetoric, essentially that's kind of ancient history now. So the Radical Center was intended as a new vision of a particular policy agenda. It was not incrementalism. Here we have Bernard Shaw saying reformers believe in change achieved by brute sanity. We really went at this with a kind of adventurous spirit of saying, okay, rather than simply engaging in incremental reforms of particular programs, let's say, okay, let's be like the New Dealers, let's be like Reconstruction Republicans and Unionist Democrats, and look at the country 30 and 40 and 50 years out and see what we should aspire to, not what we can get done in the next 6 months Washington. So the radical center is not the mushy middle, which is still with us. So, how do you come up with a broad vision? It can't be individual policy proposals as such, because people pretend otherwise. But the vast majority of big ideas and small ideas alike are already out there. On healthcare, on retirement policy, and so on. What you can do, I think, as a public intellectual and as a public policy scholar, is to decide what your hierarchy of importance is and then select existing ideas or reject them on the basis of a few overarching principles. And this is why I think there was some tension with claiming that we were supported by a voting bloc. Because the fact is, the public in this democracy and in other democracies is incoherent, is confused. I don't say that as an insult. They're struggling to live their lives, but they are not intellectuals. So all the polls show that most Americans want more spending, lower taxes, and balanced budgets, right? And what that does, for those of us in the public policy, political world, is it means that all schools can claim public opinion is on their side. So if you're a deficit hawk, you can say, look, majority of Americans want a balanced budget immediately, right? If you're a Keynesian social democrat, you can say, look, most Americans want more spending on anti-poverty programs, education, Social Security, and so on. And if you're a libertarian Republican, you can say, oh, look, they really care about lower taxes. So the single principle that we chose, and again, the book was sort of a thought experiment, if these are your values, what would the consequences be, was the idea of a citizen-based social contract. Now, one of the strange things, you never know what's going to happen when you publish something. And so, once we'd published this and we're talking about the citizen-based social contract, everyone was saying, well, what about illegal immigrants, right? Which actually, the subject did not even cross our minds, in choosing this concept. But just to make it clear, our concept of the citizen-based social contract would be exactly identical for U.S. citizens and for legal immigrants. You don't want it, for one thing, you don't want like a two-tier separate caste system. With respect to illegal immigrants, my personal opinion, it's not the institutional opinion, is that we need an amnesty in order to amnesty most illegal immigrants and make them full citizens. If I could do it overnight, I would, for reasons that have to do with not having a two-tier labor force. But so the point is, that's sort of a distraction, but it just kept coming out. But this was not, there was not some sort of nativist thing behind citizen-based. Originally, in our working draft for the Smart Society, the term was individual-based. And that just seemed weak because we wanted to reassert the idea that this is a democratic republic. It's not simply a territory with a utilitarian system, that's done in the interest of economic efficiency. No, it's a republic. And what's more, it's a republic where people have and should have economic rights, as well as civil and political and legal rights. So the idea of the citizen-based social contract, that's why we use the term citizen. But if you want to substitute individual-based or portable, you can do so. We have the citizen-based social contract, one prominent citizen. And if I can just read what we had to say about that. The most successful societies in the information age will be those that combine a Darwinian marketplace with a non-Darwinian social safety net. The more reliable and fair the safety net is, the more flexible and competitive the marketplace can be. And this is a point that I think is still contentious, even a decade later. You have to choose the safety net in such a way that it is portable from job to job, but also from industry to industry, because in the 20th century, we began the century with about a third of all Americans being farmers. And then about a third were factory workers by 1950. Now 80% of Americans are in the non-traded domestic service sector, and even many service sector jobs are being rapidly automated or in some cases outsourced. And without getting into the details of trade policy and economic policy, we wanted to come up with a social contract, a set of benefits and economic rights that are future-proof, a term we developed later, although I wish we thought of it in time for the book, so that it doesn't really matter what the industries are in 2030 or 2050 or 2100. Your citizenship, your economic rights as a member of the American Republic should not depend on the proportions of industry versus the professions or the personal service sector versus business services. And then once you have completely delinked individual well-being from a particular economic and political and social structure, then you can take advantage of what Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction, the development of new industries. The most significant application of this, as it turned out, was in the healthcare area. And again, this is an example of where, as a thought experiment, we weren't going to come up with a new approach to healthcare. All of the different options of healthcare were familiar, and they'd been debated to death in the 1990s during the attempted Clinton reforms. There were essentially 3 or 4 major ones. There was single payer. There was employer mandate. All employers would be required by an unfunded mandate to provide health care. There was pay or play. That is, you would either provide health care to your employees or you would pay into a fund, which would cover other people. And then the fourth option was individual mandate system. And the idea of the individual mandate was, there's too much emphasis on the mandate. I mean, essentially it's a portable individual system. What you would do is, in the long run, you would eliminate the employer tax deduction for health care, and then it would be purchased directly by individuals with subsidies for those who can't afford it. And it was our view at the time that if you could have had single-payer health care, it would be better. There's no doubt about that, both in terms of cost control and universal coverage. If you could go back in a time machine and pass it under Roosevelt or Truman or Johnson, then it would be preferable. But we calculated in 1999 and 2000 when we were writing the book what turned out to be correct, that you simply could not do this, partly because of the politics of money in the United States. If you look at polls, single payer is very popular, but we sort of have 2 houses in Washington. There's the House of the Voters and the House of the Donors, and the lobbies that oppose single payer are sufficiently powerful so we settled on what became the New America Healthcare Program, first under Laurie Rubiner and then under Lynn Nichols, on the basis of it as a second, sort of a reluctant second best. We were never terribly enthusiastic about the individual mandate system. It's also national. There's always been a tension between the provision of benefits at the state and federal level. It's not actually something that the economic right or the business right or the libertarian right really care strongly about. Essentially, the people who care about this are the Confederates. And speaking as a Southerner, I know the history of national policy in the U.S. very well. The only reason Medicaid and unemployment insurance are divided between the federal government and the states. This was not, the business community was not behind this. It wasn't even, free market, Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman people. It was the Southern segregationist Democrats in the 1930s, and they saw the only economic advantage of the South was keeping a poor black but also poor white workforce that had as little leverage against their employers as possible. And so they fought the New Deal tooth and nail. And because of, at that point, they were a powerful part of the Democratic coalition, which was a strange bedfellows coalition like most political parties. They failed to divide Social Security between a federal and a state component, but they succeeded with Medicare and Medicaid so that the South would have much lower levels of state funding than the rest of the country, and then they could use this to lure factories from the Northeast. So, our view was there was never a principled argument on the basis of federalism, for having these things divided between the state and the federal government. It was just this peculiar historical contingency that the segregationists had veto power when a lot of these programs. So one of the things we suggested in the Radical Center was, if benefits or programs are of truly national importance, and they're important to individuals, then there should be an alliance between the federal government and the individual. And the mere fact that something was done by the city or the county or the state in the 19th century, there was no particular reason for it. It was just because the U.S. did not yet have a single market and a single set of civil rights. So to some extent, this is not only about separating benefits from employers and making them liberal, but it's also by replacing state and local-based benefits that vary with a single national standard. And again, we're not being incremental, so this is the 2030, 2050 goal. It's not something we expected to see even in 2010, a decade later. An example of that was our rather utopian scheme of federal equalization of K through 12 funding. All the way up until the 1970s, elementary schools had been paid for primarily by local county or urban districts. As a result of a number of lawsuits in states, beginning with California in the 1970s, today in 2010, about half of K-12 education is paid for by state governments and about half by local governments. Well, the logic of equalizing the taxes at the state level also applies to equalizing funding of K through 12 at the national level. After all, rich people are concentrated in a few jurisdictions, and low-income and working-class people are spread across a continent. And there's really no moral or political case to be made, in my opinion, that a few wealthy jurisdictions should support only their immediate neighborhoods when it comes to something. If you really believe in the 21st century, education is a national priority, and given international competition. We combined it with choice, which caused a great consternation among our progressive friends. And whenever challenged about this, I gave them my reasons for saying that, well, you should not only equalize funding, but you should allow school choice too. And my reasons are Ted Kennedy, Jesse Jackson, Bill Clinton, and nowadays it would be Barack Obama. That is, if wealthy liberal Democrats do not send their kids to public schools and send them to private schools, then it does seem to me hypocritical, if you're a liberal, to say that poor and working class kids can only be stuck in the particular public schools that the wealthy liberals are avoiding, with their own children. So now in practice, it would not have made that much of a difference, because school choice only works where you have large metro areas and other schools are in driving distance. So in practice, in most of the country, it would have meant equalizing funding for public schools. So as I said, we differed from the left on school choice. One of the other fights we picked with the left, which we're continuing to wage, is over tax reform. Because our view was, the logic behind our version of the Radical Center was that you have to look at public policy not from abstract perspectives of equity alone, though that's important, but from national competitiveness and growth. We are competing with other industrial societies. We are trying to adopt new disruptive technology as rapidly as possible. And so when we pick a tax system, it can't simply be one that is maximally progressive. If there were no other rivals in the world, we might do this. But in the 1990s and the 2000s, all of the industrial nations, except for the U.S., have cut their corporate income taxes to attract capital and foreign direct investment. And economists agree, liberal economists as well as conservative economists, that consumption taxes are the least growth-distorting taxes. They happen to be fairly regressive, but you can get around that by various ways. So one of our proposals, which I think stands up after a decade, is having a national consumption tax. We were somewhat ahead of the curve on promoting this. The particular form we advocate in the book is not the best. We supported a progressive consumption tax. Essentially, this would have been It's called a Calder tax. It was invented by Nicholas Calder, a British economist in the 1950s. And economists love it. And that was one of the reasons why we were persuaded. What you do is you take all income and then you subtract savings, and then the rest is treated as consumption, and you write the government a check based on that. Well, the problem with books is sometimes you have to publish it. You can't just keep researching forever. And so after the book was already in print, we did the due diligence that we should have done earlier and discovered that the Calder tax has been tried by 2 countries since it was proposed in the 1950s, by Sri Lanka and India. And they both got rid of it after a couple of years because it was so unpopular. Well, why was it unpopular? Well, imagine if the state in which you live, or the District of Columbia, abolishes the sales tax, right? But then on April 15th, you have to write a check for the total combined sales tax that you paid the previous year. Now, if people had any idea how much sales tax they pay, there would be the biggest tax revolt since Howard Jarvis, right? You can get exactly the same, and for this reason, many of my libertarian friends like sales taxes. They're very difficult no, they don't like sales taxes. They like income taxes and payroll taxes, which are highly visible. I'm sorry, they like income taxes. Income taxes are visible. You write the check on April 15th, on today, tax day, right? Today, Americans are not sending in checks for their payroll tax or their state and local sales taxes. Those are invisible taxes. And it's no coincidence that in the last 20 years, we've had income tax revolts in the United States. We've not had a payroll tax revolt, even though the payroll tax was jacked up dramatically in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. And we also don't have sales tax revolts. So as of 2010, I think that we can achieve the same goals of a progressive consumption tax with a value-added tax. Also today, the Economic Growth Program at the New America Foundation, of which I'm policy director, we're publishing a study that we commissioned from the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, calculating how much you could reduce the corporate income tax by having a small value-added tax. This shows you, just very briefly, the United States relies almost exclusively at the federal level on payroll taxes and on income taxes. Most other advanced industrial democracies have a 3-legged stool of national consumption tax, usually a value-added tax, as well as income taxes and payroll taxes. So with respect to the radical center, I think that if you substitute a VAT for a progressive consumption tax, then we were sort of ahead of the curve on this as well, because it's only recently that there's been a lot of discussion about this shift to a national consumption tax. Last week, Paul Volcker made headlines by saying favorable things about it. Okay, not all ideas survive the decade. Here we have a poster entitled Expendability. It says, Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and Ensign Ricky are beaming down to the planet. Guess who's not coming back? So I've front-loaded the discussion with things I think we got right, and then, I'm going to be quite honest about things that we got horribly, horribly wrong. 2 crashes in 1 decade must make us think differently about the stock market. Now, when we were researching and writing the Radical Center, everyone except for a few forlorn Bolsheviks thought that we were living in the era of the Great Moderation, that inflation was vanished forever, that the stock market would have a perpetual 7% return, and therefore Americans weren't getting a good deal from Social Security. And what's more, all Americans, including the poorest of the poor, needed to get into the stock market, right? Joseph Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, was a famous Wall Street stockbroker in the 1920s. And he was asked one time how he had saved his fortune. And he said, when my shoeshine boy began giving me stock tips, I got out of the market. So In retrospect, when policy wonks in Washington were saying that, we don't need to raise wages for the poor, and we don't need to increase entitlements, but we need to get them in the stock market too, then at that point you should have just gone into cash. That's all I can say. So in this spirit of contrition, we wrote, on the other hand, opponents of a two-tier social security system, that is one with partial privatization, raised the specter of economic depressions, stock market bubbles, wars, and other catastrophes. It is not necessary to believe in rosy scenarios about the stock market, however, to favor a two-tier pension system that promotes individual savings. Well, yes, it is. We've read all of the authorities. You see how I'm trying to get off the hook, like Alan Greenspan. I'm appealing to the herd wisdom. We read the World Bank, we read the IMF, we read the Clinton administration reports. They all said, in the long run, because government Social Security might be insecure, you should have a 2 or 3 tier system of private pensions and of personal savings invested in the stock market, which is more secure than the government, right? And we should have fought back at that. We were not radical enough, because there's no way this can possibly work. If the economy grows so slowly that revenues from Social Security are going to be disastrous, well, the returns from the stock market are going to be disastrous too, right? If it booms, then money is going to come flooding into Social Security, and you actually don't need to be diverting lots of money to, you can have 401ks and IRAs, but there's no reason why you would make people more dependent on them rather than less. There are only 2 scenarios in which the argument that people rely too much on government pensions, even through stock bubbles and crashes and depressions, would make sense. One would be if there's growth in a region of the world like Asia or another country where you have your private savings are invested, but there's very slow growth in your country like the United States. In theory, it's possible. The problem is in the most rapidly growing countries in the world, and particularly ones with the big export surpluses like the energy-producing countries and the East Asian countries, most corporations are either state-owned or effectively state-controlled. So you can invest in the McDonald's in Beijing, but you're not going to invest in the major manufacturing, energy companies. That may change through liberalization, but at least that's plausible. The implausible scenario is one that you could find maybe on a Star Trek episode, in which, for purposes of Social Security, the economy grew at 1.8% for 50 years. But for purposes of your 401k, it grew at 7% for 51 years, while remaining the same economy in this Star Trek parallel universe. So mea culpa, or via culpa. This is probably the dumbest sentence to which I ever signed my name. And there are millions of sentences, so I may be mistaken. Of this combined rate of 12.4%, we recommend that approximately 5% of each worker's wages go directly into his or her own personal retirement savings account. And again, the Clinton administration came very close to proposing this. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, my friend and mentor, was in favor of partial privatization of Social Security. But nevertheless, my feelings about that sentence now in 2010 are summed up by this slide. I think the other area that we needed to reconsider as a result of the great crash of '08 was baby bonds or child trust funds. And with this was central to our assets program, which is now focused on other things increasingly. And they do enormous work, and I've always endorsed this idea that we need to increase financial assets as well as income of the poor and the working poor in the United States. But I do think that in retrospect, the Child Trust Fund or baby bond proposal, which originated with Tony Blair, the Third Way Labour Party in Britain. They actually passed a fairly small child trust fund. This was the idea that you give all children a certain amount of money at birth, and then you can, and then through the miracle of compound interest and growth in the stock market, at 18 they get much more money, and they can then use that money to put a down payment on a home or a college education or something like this. Just, being candid in retrospect about the inclusion in the radical center, I was skeptical about it for several reasons. For one thing is, we already have programs to help you go to college, and we already have programs to help you buy a house. If anything, it's too easy to buy a house. If you're a ninja, no income, no job or assets. The country was not needing a new program to let people go to college or buy houses. And what's more, there was always a certain illogic in the idea that you would, instead of simply having the economy grow for 18 years and then taxing people in the richer economy to help out the needy 18 years from now, that you would give people on birth this amount of money, which would be set aside in a savings account. But my major problem with this idea was always American political culture. Because, as I say, we chose citizen-based because of the connection with the democratic Republican philosophy. Whatever may be the case in Tony Blair's Britain, in the United States, all social insurance and welfare policies that have widespread public support are based on earning. They're based on effort. Proposals that people just be given money have never gone anywhere. And so in this respect, I think the Child Trust Fund proposal, while you make a case for it, and again, I'm open-minded as a matter of theory, but just in America, given its Republican, citizen-oriented work ethic, it was doomed from the beginning like a George McGovern's demo grant. He proposed giving every American $1,000. That was his 1972 campaign. He carried one state, was that it? I think one state. So there's some things you can do in the UK that you cannot do in the United States. And I think the baby bond proposal, like privatization of Social Security, made sense if you assumed that the asset bubble economy would last forever. But if you thought it was an asset bubble, then we should have been thinking about what would happen when the bubble crashed. Here we have unintentional irony alert, which is something you can relish if you're rereading your words of many years before. Here we have the stock market, plus our statement, a new citizen-based program of broadening capital ownership can ensure that all Americans share in the economic benefits of creative destruction. So we put a lot of subjects in there that should have been left out in retrospect. I think if you lose a couple of chapters, and on some of these things they hold up, on others they don't. But we have global warming, electoral reform, affirmative action, immigration reform, zoning, nonprofit reform. Yeah, we got into zoning, believe it or not. And just before I give you the next slide, I beg you to remember that the past is another country, that people in the 1990s were not like modern human beings. They had totally different concerns from people who live in the 21st century, right? So you have to put yourself in the mindset of these beings, and try to imagine what the world looked like from their perspective. And that means that when we were finishing up the drafts of the Radical Center in the summer of 2000, the major controversy, or one of the major policy controversies in Washington, was over stem cells and genetic engineering. And so there was a big battle with sort of strange bedfellows. Jeremy Rifkin on the left had teamed up with Francis Fukuyama and Leon Kass on the right to ban all genetic modification of human beings, even for disease. I teamed up with Virginia Postrel, the editor of Reason magazine, and with E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard biologist, to have a counter petition. The assumption of the petitions back and forth were that within the next few years, now that the genome had been decoded, we would have the capability to have great numbers of mutants in America. And so the question was, are all mutants bad, or are there like good mutants and bad mutants? And so I think I was actually thinking about this as I strolled into the New America office in DuPont Circle, when I learned about the 9/11 attacks, and the planes hitting the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. So hindsight is better than foresight, particularly if you have 3 eyes. Well, just to conclude, the world has changed dramatically. The political system in which we've organized New America and for which the book was written has changed a great deal. It's kind of like a glacier. It doesn't seem to be moving, but then if you come back in a few years, it's gone 5 feet. The left in the 90s was defined by kind of academic speech codes and multiculturalism and identity politics, and that has faded away. Partly because many of the liberal positions have prevailed, and partly some of them have lost. But basically, the social issue left has kind of faded, and now there is a very flourishing, robust neo-New Deal economic liberalism. Paul Krugman, who used to attack New Dealers, is now well to the left of most New Deal liberals, and Joseph Stiglitz and Jamie Galbraith and others. So the liberalism is quite different than it was, and there is a liberal political economy again, with which at least I would still have some issues, because I think they neglect the need for having productive efficiency in a global economy, and they focus too much on redistribution. But there's a different left. On the right, notwithstanding the Tea Party, the kind of libertarianism that was dominated even half of the Democratic Party in the 1990s has been discredited by events, by 2 stock market crashes and the greatest mass unemployment since the Great Depression. So that when C. Fred Bergston of the Peterson Institute, is calling for tariffs on China, when Donald Marin, sort of libertarian conservative, just published an essay in the World Affairs Journal pointing out that Scandinavia proves that you can have an enormously high welfare state and large welfare state and still be extremely competitive in world markets. So things have differed. So I think we're kind of in a different universe now. To some degree, I don't know whether we influenced the debate or not, whether these things would have happened otherwise, but certainly the individual mandate model, to the extent that's a component of the Obama democratic reform, which does have pay or play elements too. It's not a pure individual mandate system. We can claim to have been ahead of the curve on that. We will get a value-added tax at some point in the next 20 or 30 years. It may take a while, but now this is becoming central to discussion: national consumption tax, and we will at some point have mutants, notwithstanding the lobby of the anti-mutant league.
On that.
That's right. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.